Hi everyone, welcome to the Culture of Life podcast from Human Life International. I'm Tad Wojcik, the Mission Research Specialist, here with Father Shenan Boquet, as always, our president.
Oh, good, Tad, to be with you one more time.
Yes, absolutely. We're getting headway with this, aren't we?
Yes, it's exciting.
Wonderful. So today we're talking about your article from February 21st. It's on euthanasia and some developments in Italy. Could you describe the decision the recent decision of the Italian Constitutional Court about, I think there was a proposed referendum on, was it euthanasia or assisted suicide?
Assisted suicide.
Assisted suicide, okay. And then, that's good, because we'll be getting to the distinction there later in the episode. So just describe that and kind of the implications of the decision first to start us off.
So in 2019 is where we have to go back, because it was then where the Constitutional Court gave an open door in the sense of allowing, in rare cases, which is the language often used to advance these kinds of issues, whether it be euthanasia, abortion, euthanasia, assisted suicide. Mm-hmm. But here in 2019, the Constitutional Court of Italy, allowed in rare cases for assisted suicide. So what happened now, as we saw in just recently, where those who are advancing, wanting to see euthanasia, wanting to see assisted suicide, become legalized, across the board, where basically you remove all the limitations that maybe the court initially allowed, or maybe that legislators may have in the law, and the court upheld, may have set as a bench, if you will. And so what's happened now is that these advocates want those limitations removed. Mm-hmm. And so what they did is they passed a petition around, and actually garnered about 1.2 million signatures from Italians wanted a referendum on that 2019 decision. Again, opening up the possibility for euthanasia and assisted suicide to become more normative, if you will. And so what happened was the court rejected it. And it rejected it, first of all, because it saw that this was not a legislative act, that this was really an attempt to sidestep a legislative decision, in other words, to change the law. And so that's very important, because basically, even though you might have garnered, which is a sizable amount of people, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the will, quote, of the people. And so in a legislative process, it allows legislators and parliamentarians and people to interact in this discussion.
And I think you said it was a petition of, it was 1.2 million signatures, which I thought was really huge for such a large, for such a niche issue, but it's fascinating.
I mean, it's a large size, but I mean, in the sense of it doesn't really truly represent the large population.
But still, it's kind of frightening.
It can be ignored.
That it's so huge.
Exactly. It's scary, actually. Especially coming from a country where Catholicism, at least in name, is very strong and very dominant. Mm-hmm. And so it does raise a lot of questions. But, I don't want to sound like the court, did us a great favor. Well, I'm very pleased that the court recognized what was being done in an attempt to, and actually the court, I think it's an important quote, basically said the minimum constitutionally necessary protection of human life in general, and with particular reference to the weak and the vulnerable, the court is recognized that, that what was being advanced was not really securing the weak and the poor, protecting them from the possibility of an imposition of assisted suicide or euthanasia upon them.
So it was, pardon the pun, it was sort of like a stay of execution, kind of but not quite, not everything that could be hoped for, but at least kind of a recognition of.
But I think it does, like anything else. What you said earlier, when you get 1.2 people that sign on to this petition, it does cause concern, because we can see that this is a mindset where people really believe that this is a good. In other words, euthanasia or assisted suicide. So I think we need to really be very mindful that this is not something to be ignored. And the court didn't just, completely ignore it, or in a sense say it shouldn't advance. It just said this is not the way in which this should be addressed. And so that now we know it's going to just advance those who are advocating for this to keep moving forward. And now we can see how that's going to become more in a public debate. It's going to be moving toward their various people in their houses of government. You're going to see the influence of very NGOs and other agencies from around the world get involved in this. And I think what's important is the advocates for life, us, and those who stand with us. We see from history we see from previous nations where they have legalized euthanasia, assisted suicide, both or one or the other, where what happens is all the limitations begin to be peeled away. We saw the same thing with the abortion argument, right? So that in the beginning it was supposed to be in these rare situations and, very restricted. And immediately we saw those restrictions ripped away. And so basically it just becomes unlimited. So this is the same thing here. And so I think the court does afford us, Tad, an opportunity, to look at, when it speaks about the weak and the vulnerable, and also, even though the court doesn't mention this, what about informed consent? So we could be talking about, involuntary euthanasia here. So we could be talking about, a government imposing its will upon the most vulnerable people who have no one to speak for themselves, speak for them. And so we can see an imposition upon others, and their voice and their own conscience and their own informed consent gets removed. So there's a lot of danger in here that this particular situation raises for us.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just Italy that we're talking about this particular situation, but as you mentioned in the article, it's euthanasia is legal in, I think you said, 12 countries at this time.
Correct.
And I'm not sure if you give a number for physician-assisted suicide, but let's talk about that, the distinction here. Let's move into that aspect of kind of the technicalities here, and then talk about their relationship with each other and also Catholic teaching on both.
Absolutely. So when we consider, sometimes they're interchanged. People will use them interchangeably, but they are different. Mm-hmm. So first of all, with euthanasia, it involves a third party. So here you're dealing with someone, who is actually directly intervening, either probably usually through some type of chemical, some type of drug that is given to another person with the intention of killing them. So here, whether it be voluntary, involuntary, passive, or active, so the various aspects of euthanasia. So you have someone that is really, involved directly in the taking of a human life.
And their involuntary would be essentially murder.
Murder,
right?
Exactly.
And voluntary would be kind of murder, but with someone's consent.
Consent.
Active would be some kind of drug, like you were talking about, and passive would be withholding of
it could be food, water, some type of therapy intervention.
That would keep someone alive.
Exactly.
Right?
So for us as Catholics, for example, when we're talking about nutrition and hydration, which as long as the nutrition and hydration can accomplish its ends, in other words, the person benefits from it, it is always considered ordinary care. It's not considered medical care at all from a Catholic point. And so this is something where you can see, here you can see people in nursing facilities, skilled nursing facilities. You can see people who may have lost their cognitive ability. You can see a variety of people come to mind, at least they should come to mind when we're talking about this kind of situation. Now, with regard to assisted suicide, which I think more people are probably familiar with because it has been legalized in a number of countries. Most people know it under the term as medically assisted suicide or physician-assisted suicide. So here we're dealing with the person. So let's just say that I want I choose to have someone assist me in the end of my life. So it's not the doctor that is the actor in the sense of the direct cause. The doctor here provides the means to me, and then I myself take the drug or whatever means. I'm the one that becomes the actor. I impose it upon myself. So this is why we call it assisted. So basically, unlike euthanasia, where the doctor, in most cases, is the direct act, the one who's actually performing the act, injecting.
Right, the agent in the action is not the one who's dying, but in the case of assisted suicide, it is the person who wants to die.
And it's just good to know, one, the distinction, because it helps us in how we speak about it, but number two is it also shows both, involve the taking of a human life, whether one giving consent means the value of life is no longer recognized and seen, and it's both are, from our Catholic understanding of the dignity of human life, are not permissible. They are immoral, and they are always immoral in every situation. So this is something that we need to articulate. That's what really makes this conversation important for us, not only as Catholics, but really as Christian people, as non-Christians, as a human family. Very important for us to see the danger in this.
Right, and you gave a quote from the Holy Father who addressed this topic recently in a recent Wednesday audience, and his part of his quote said, "This ethical principle, meaning that life is sacred and to be protected, neither of these forms of offense against life are permissible. He says this ethical principle concerns everyone, not just Christians or believers. So that was
Exactly.
a long-winded way of saying it's not. It is a matter of natural law because it ultimately impinges on the question of murder, which is something that is not merely a Catholic teaching.
No,
It's a fundamental. In as much as Catholic teaching is the fulfillment of the natural law, that it is. I shouldn't say merely, but anyway, it's fundamental to every moral understanding.
Well, life is a good,
Right.
and it should be
Right.
protected.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even looking at the fact of life itself is good.
Mm-hmm.
So whether one's Catholic, Christian, or not, we believe that life is good.
Right.
It has a value in and of itself,
Mm-hmm.
and so we should protect that value. And,
Right.
So that's what the Holy Father is obviously addressing, because
Mm-hmm.
obviously there are people in Italy that are around the world that don't share our Catholic views. So on the sins of omission for nutrition and hydration would be an example. But nonetheless, we advance this objective truth so that others will see that every life, no matter what, is of value and must be protected.
Mm-hmm.
So it's again with the advancing of the culture of death. And we use this term so often. Many in our audience are familiar with the term, but we don't always see its application. And because you have a person wearing a white robe in the sense of a nice lab jacket, who's actually the one in the case of euthanasia is the agent upon which this death occurs. So we have so people just we see this. Stealth euthanasia we talk about. Where it's done through means that we don't always see. So over medicating someone, with the purpose of hastening their death. So basically, we're talking about an issue of euthanization. So we have to really talk about these things. So, and it's good for people to be aware because we all are caring for other human beings, especially those of us who have aging parents, aging family members, who are in situations where they need care. And so the decisions that need to be made need to be ethically made. And we need to be aware of the stealthy conversations that are occurring and those that are advancing a very different agenda. And so I compliment again the Holy Father, for using his Wednesday audience, knowing in the backdrop was this conversation going on. And so I think again it just shows the prophetic voice and the courageous voice that the Holy Father is adding, to the dignity of life. He's defending it. He's reminding the world, hey, wake up.
Right. And he himself is an elderly man, so that it perhaps it's close to his heart, and we all have relatives. I had grandparents all die in the past couple of years actually myself, so it's a deeply touching issue. Suicide also is another. It's a terrible topic, but so. In that sense, let's talk about, you talked about the advancing of the culture of death. Let's talk about how and where in particular in our own country and other parts of the world these two offenses against life are being pushed and the strength of that.
Yeah, those of us who are from the United States that that are listening, so obviously we have a number of states that have through their legislative process have advanced the issue of euthanasia and assisted suicide. So here, physician-assisted suicide. And so the United States is not, absent from this debate. We would see the same thing happening recently. I noted my article about Great Britain's Medical Association. Basically in a very narrow, 1% difference, basically opened removed, in a sense, any concern about legalizing assisted suicide, medically assisted suicide. And I think there, again, it just raises issues, in the countries where it exists, but in countries where it's not, people need to be on guard of this process, this movement that continues to not look at human life from its intrinsic value, but really from a utilitarian, approach in the sense of how we would treat objects, things. But the human person has a value in and of itself, of himself or herself, that can never be imposed, infringed upon. And again, the Holy Father is talking about this, and he uses a recent comment of Benedict XVI, who people know is growing in age, and now himself is talking about, what's facing him is death. And the Holy Father, not only talks about the evil of euthanasia and the evil of assisted suicide, but he talks about the fear of death. This is what really is driving this, is a lack of understanding of the beauty of life, but also, what awaits us, the value of life beyond this moment, beyond the situation, beyond old age, beyond terminal illness. And, this is the conversation the Holy Father really is raising. And basically, as the bishops of Italy did, and as the Holy Father, said, basically quoting each other, and that is, we should not be, causing death. We're not here to hasten death, but we're also not here to ignore its reality. But we have an answer to death. We have a response to death. St. Paul says, "Death, oh, where is your sting?"
It's really the central
right.
mystery of Christianity is the mystery of Christ's transformation of death,
right.
Conquering of death and transformation of death through his own death
right.
for us who die in him.
That's right. So I think that the real challenge that the Holy Father raises is what John Paul talks about in Evangelium Vitae, and even with the Declaration on Euthanasia from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in 1980 said. So we take both of them and we can look at the comments and realize, and I think it's important. I mean, I'm going to find the one from John Paul because I think it's just a great way of understanding when he says, true compassion leads to sharing another's pain. It does not kill the person whose suffering we cannot bear. So this is really, John Paul in Evangelium Vitae, gets to the heart of the matter, which is reaffirming what was said by the Declaration on Euthanasia by the CDF. And that is, where the real compassion is to accompany this person, to be present to them, to assist them, to comfort them with our care and our time and the resources we have. And it's also very important that Pope Francis also shows a distinction in his comments, and he talks about the difference between palliative care and the difference between hastening someone's death. And in palliative care, we recognize that a person may be dealing with a terminal illness. And so, or maybe dealing with a severe illness that may not be terminal, but may be moving in that direction. Could be old age. The body is starting to fail and doesn't function like it once did. So with comfort care and providing medications and walking with that individual and improving basically their daily life through that kind of care that can be both medical, emotional, and obviously spiritual, they're happier. We're walking with them. Versus what John Paul is talking about and what the congregation said that then in Pope Francis, that versus the fact of hastening, causing someone's death, because we're afraid of all the demands and the burdens that it's going to place upon us, my time, my energy, my resource. And so the Holy Father, Pope Francis, made some very powerful statements. And I would encourage, our listeners, you can go to in the article and click on the links. It'll lead you to the full text of the Holy Father's Wednesday audience. And so he starts by talking about St. Joseph, and he ends with a prayer to St. Joseph. But in between, it's packed full of beautiful teaching on the church, teaching from the church on this issue. And again, I think it's an important issue because, as I said earlier, when you have a utilitarian approach, the greatest good for the greatest amount, and people really approach life purely from an objectable, kind of a subjective value. What can I get from this particular situation or a thing? This is how we look at human life. No, we don't look at human life that way. And so I think it's so important. And I want you to imagine, Ted, you're a young man, guess I'm still somewhat young, but when you consider when you consider that that we have many people who are at a stage of life, and it's a frightening point because of the way society looks at life. And so people going to their doctors, hospitals, walking very timid, very concerned, especially those that have no family members, or who maybe have uncatechized family members, maybe family members who have an erroneous understanding of the value of human life. It's a scary place to be because in certain places, no one's there to speak for you. And maybe in a certain situation, you've lost your ability to speak for yourself. And now you have no one there for you. Now it becomes the state that speaks for you, and so it can be a very dangerous and a very lonely and a very place that it may not, in many cases, does not always end well. And so this is why it's great to have this conversation, because I'm hoping that what it might do is stir others who listen to us today, to dive a little deeper, into what the church actually does teach. What are the documents of the church? And we mentioned two of them, Tad, the Declaration on Euthanasia, Evangelium Vitae. But there are other documents that the church has issued, in this whole journey about what is our response, to the dignity of life. And one of the documents that I would recommend to our audience is the Ethical and Religious Directives, in healthcare from the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops. It really is the document that here in the United States that advances very clear principles on healthcare and Catholic healthcare. How do we approach the care of human beings? How do we respect the dignity of every human life in the care that the church provides, and at every stage? And there are the principles make it clear. Euthanasia is never acceptable. Assisted suicide is never acceptable, nor can we hasten the death, even under the guise of care. So it makes very clear what our responses are. And I would encourage those who are listening, if you're not familiar with them, just go to the USCCB website, type in Ethical and Religious Directives. It'll come up with the 6th edition, and read it. It's very short, very clear principles, but each has an introduction, each section. So on the dignity of life, the social responsibility, all the way to the end-of-life care. So it covers the whole gambit, and it's a document very much worth spending time with.
Thank you, Father, for that recommendation. We hope our listeners find that and other documents from the Vatican, and also resources on Human Life International's own website about these issues. Okay, Father, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk. I always like to bring us to the spiritual aspects of things here. And you've mentioned a couple times now this utilitarian mindset, this kind of godless, atheistic approach to human life and its value, which is the principal thing that Human Life International fights against. But in this particular aspect of euthanasia and assisted suicide, we can talk about that. You mentioned the utilitarian mindset that other people have, right? This external aspect of, this is an old person, this is a sick person. Because sometimes euthanasia is a sick person who's not old, right? It's just someone.
A child.
Just it's a mercy killing is the kind of
term they use.
It's an oxymoron, or to say that because it's murder. No matter what confused understanding the administrator of that action has. But what about lack of belief? There's a couple things I wanted to touch on. The lack of belief in God and the afterlife, right? This sort of like clinging to life at all costs and to physical health and kind of comfort is sort of understandable, but ultimately flawed hedonism. That's based. The flaw is that lack of afterlife and lack of acceptance of the cross and redemptive suffering. That was the other aspect I wanted to talk about. Sorry, that's a lot, Father. Is there a way we can kind of explore those, maybe?
Why don't we look at what you brought up, prior and kind of tied in a little bit, and that is, you're absolutely right, Tad. That when of course we've been kind of referring, and Holy Father Pope Francis talked mostly about elderly, terminally ill, but you're absolutely correct. I mean, it does not discriminate against age. We have seen young children below the age of 6, euthanized, and so here, you can see the danger, and we've seen people.
What was that case? It was Alfie. I forgot his name.
Guard, and you have another Charlie Guard and Alfie
Evans, I think.
Yeah, I think so. That was two recent
it.
cases about maybe 2 years ago, maybe.
Yeah.
I wrote on both of those cases, but those are examples. But you can have a person that maybe has whatever age they may be, that has lost their cognitive ability. Maybe they're in a coma. So you have a lot of ways that this can be enacted. So across the whole gambit of human life at every stage, and so that's a very important. And another thing I want to go back to, and tied into this, is what does the Church? That's why the ethical and religious directives, what we call the ERDs, the directives, are so important. Because, for example, let's say that you have a person that is diagnosed with a terminal illness. What is the response? What is the ethical response that a person must make in such a moment? And so what does the Church teach about that? Remember, we said earlier, life is a good. It has to be protected and valued. So that doesn't mean that I have to exhaust every means possible, to continue have my life continue on and on and on.
Right. Life is not the ultimate good, right?
Exactly. So that's getting back to that spiritual, was realizing that, as Christians and as people of God, we realize that we are pilgrims, that our life here is a blessing, is a gift, and that within that gift is also that the recognition that my life is also in a movement toward that ultimate moment, that ultimate end, which really ends in the bosom of the heavenly God. And so, and that's a very different understanding, that you're right, that where people who are not looking at life from that view, it has the tendency to put things all on this world, to put everything in this moment, because it becomes the ultimate end, as you said. So, but back for a second, on what is my response? Right. So in the ethical and religious directives, those principles are clear that, what we call ordinary, what most people may call ordinary, but proportionate, disproportionate means, ordinary, extraordinary means. But what we're looking at is, the cost to benefit. In a sense, meaning not the human person. The person is not the cost to benefit. What we're talking about is the intervention, the therapy. For example, let's say that, I've been diagnosed with cancer. And the doctors have told me there's really nothing more that modern science can do. So now, but I can, avail myself to maybe interventions that can mitigate it, slow it down, maybe minimize the pain, the discomfort. In other words, give me more time. There are many ways to approach this, but it starts always with the individual who is the one that makes the decision. And so when we come to the other side of the coin, which what we're talking about. Here, it's not the patient or the surrogate, the spokesperson for that individual that's making the decision. It's another individual, like in euthanasia, all right? Even the voluntary, in other words, if I want to be euthanized, so please euthanize me. Maybe I've given my consent, but there would be a very questionable, is that real, true consent when a person is, feeling maybe unwanted, afraid, anxious. So there's a way that we need to talk about these things and be able to help people, which goes back to that quote by John Paul, that if a person is feeling this way, that's a cry, that saying, I'm alone, I feel, I'm afraid. So this is a time for us, to step to the plate, not to end their suffering by ending the life of the person. So we haven't really ended their suffering. What we've done is ended our opportunity to respond to them, as John Paul said. And then you have the other side where, it's the person is given the means, and yet medicine is meant to heal. It's meant to cause no harm, do no harm. The whole understanding of the good, that medicine is meant to advance. In murder, the taking of a life, whether it be by the doctor's hand or by the agent being the patient themselves or another person doing it for them, this is not the response that we should have. And so here, for us in HLI, and of course in so many others that walk with us, and especially advancing our Christian view of anthropology, the human person, obviously our response is not the death of an individual. It's not the hastening of death. It's not causing that death. But at the same time, it's walking with that person who may be dying. They may be moving toward death. Their death may be imminent. We have a response in that palliative care that we offer to someone, and managed care, even managing someone's pain, managing the medicines that we use to manage their pain. It doesn't cause their death, doesn't hasten their death, but we're assisting and we are giving comfort care. And so this also now, Tad, raises questions about hospice care, that in our country and many countries that do very beautiful, beautiful work. That's a different subject for a different day, but it still raises questions because, I myself have been in moments where I've seen, decisions being made under hospice care because of poor catechesis, poor understanding, and making decisions that really do not reflect, the dignity of human life and cause, hasten the death of another individual. So it's something that, again, we need to keep talking about so that we can help people. And that's HLI's main goal, and this is what my articles really are about. It's not a news blurb. It's not meant to, to kind of give the nightly news. It really is to spark a conversation about spirit and life, which is what you're trying to get me to end with, and in the sense of that spiritual component. So what I would add, Tad, to this is having served in parish life for most of my priestly life, and of course the last 11 years here, privileged to serve at HLI and to serve its global mission. But most of my life has been in parish ministry. And, having been in the homes of many people and accompanying them to the journey and moment of death, it is a beautiful journey that the church accompanies with that soul. And it's important for us to be in those moments, in the hospitals, the skilled facilities, in the homebound, and to offer not only the sacraments of the church, very, very important to bring the sacraments of the church to the people of God most in need, but also to help them prepare. And one of the things I've learned, by getting into people's homes as early as possible, so long before there is the announcement that they're in the stages of dying, it could be simply issues of older age that have now working with someone, is to talk to them about this. We should not be afraid of talking about these kinds of important subjects about the life and our response to these situations, and helping people to not be afraid, and not to be afraid of death. In the sense to be able to know that death is real. It will cause a period of isolation from those that we love, but we know that it's not the end. We know that, like you said, our Lord conquered death. He's destroyed its power, and so there's nothing to fear. But if we don't have that conversation, then we leave them, in the isolation. We leave them in the anxiousness, and that's why it's so important to be present, and then to help our doctors, help our nurses. This is what I love about, the ethical and religious directives. It gives us a way to have a conversation with those who are providing care, whether they're Catholic or not Catholic. We can also begin to educate family members, on how to prepare themselves and their loved one, for this journey and this final journey in this world. And no greater gift can we give than ourselves, our time, our resources to help them in that journey. And so I see this, again, the Holy Father raising it is a real chance. And I love when he challenges, says, our elderly and our sick and our dying should not feel that the only answer for them is to be euthanized or to be, put to death. And he said that's wrong. We don't look at human persons this way. And he's absolutely, of course, correct. And I think this is why, in our parishes, our pastoral ministry, our way that we bring the sacraments to people, that we need to really step up that conversation. Because what people see on TV, what they get in magazines, on movies, so many other places, is a very different narrative. And how many people feel that they're a burden? What a horrible word.
I was going to bring up the case of assisted suicide, because in that case, it's not even, I suppose it's comparable to voluntary euthanasia, but otherwise it's unique in that the person himself wants to die.
Right.
And that's where I was, I think personally the only way to overcome that is ultimately from within the individual to accept as the redemptive aspects of suffering, but that requires a leap of faith in God and belief. And that's why it's a terrible state of our culture where people can, so many suicides rising exponentially in the last couple of years with the lockdowns and everything else, especially. Isolations. And that's not the case of physician-assisted suicide, that's just suicide in general, but that suicidal instinct, I wonder if that's not ultimately the main, the linchpin of the culture of death, is like a suicidal hatred of one's own human life.
Yeah. Well, the Marx used to talk about that, actually. He always connected them, because when you start with an anti-life mentality in the beginning of life, when you're opposed to life, unwilling to engender life, to welcome life, then the natural end product is you're also going to take that same approach toward the end of life, or to certain situations of age or disabilities. So you can see how they really do overlap. Just two different bookends of life, but yet the same anti-life mentality. Right. And I think too, with all of it, Ted, is we just need to really look at the idea that when a person, because I've heard it with my own ears. I really have heard people say to me, I don't want to be a burden to someone. And it really is a narrative that has taken hold. And we have to unravel that narrative. No life is a burden. There are situations that place demands on each of us and our response to each other. And this is again where the social doctrine of the church comes to bear. And of course, the first principle of that doctrine is the dignity of the human person. So made in the image and likeness of God, respect for human persons. But the second aspect of that social doctrine is community. And that is very important here. And this is what the Holy Father is talking about, both John Paul, Francis, and also the doctrine of the faith, is that I have a duty toward you, and you have a duty toward me. And to realize that we live in community, we function in community, we are social beings. We're made for each other. And so when
like Mother Teresa said, we belong to each other.
And thank you. I love that little quote from Mother. And why? Because it reminds me that I have a moral obligation and moral duty to my brother and sister. Now, what does that mean? Well, we'll have to do it for another podcast,
right,
because it has different meanings. Okay, and so, but they all start with respect for human persons, respect for every human life at every stage. And if someone feels burdened or feels burdensome, then that's where you start. That's the conversation to begin and to find out why. Because there are people who feel this way, and it's because they've been made to feel that way, or maybe they've been abandoned by their family. They're alone. So there's so many dynamics. But this is what makes me and you step to the plate. This is what we're here. And so I want to, again, just, encourage, our audience, please go to the links, on the Wednesday audience of Pope Francis on this conversation, because it is worth the time to reflect on what the Holy Father is saying, and to be aware of not only what's going on in the Constitutional Court in Italy, but to really understand what's happening here in the United States. And to really look into especially California, you can look into Oregon.
Right, the Right to Die movement.
And it's there. I mean, we're grateful that it hasn't advanced as quickly as maybe it wants to advance, because there's still something within human beings that really don't like this, because they see the real danger here. Because why can't I euthanize you? Why can't you euthanize me? Where does this arbitrary definition come from? Who has a right to life, who doesn't? So you can see the danger here, because someone else is determining you have value or you don't have value. And we know where that goes. And so that is the fundamental danger here. It's an arbitrary approach toward human life. So again, I know we're going to talk about this a lot more, because I can tell you this is a growing issue. And especially here in the United States, where we have an aging population, we have we are seeing a continued decrease in birth rates. So we have the baby boomers now who reach the age of Medicare in our country, needing health care. And as we see in other countries like Japan, again, for example, an aging population. And so what's going to happen is the fear, what's our response when we can't care for them, when we can't spend, we don't have enough money to care for their needs? What happens? And this is where the danger can be. So now we can designate certain people as having a right to certain health care or not health care, or we can choose to get to a certain part where we encourage euthanization, or I can assist you. You don't have to suffer anymore. False compassion, all right? So this so-called mercy killing, which it's killing, all right? So there's no mercy in that, all right? So this is why it's going to be great for us, Tad, to pick this up again. And I can tell you right now that I just got an article, on this same Constitutional Court story that now sadly involves, some members that are promoting this as something that could be a good. And so it'll be something that we'll probably pick up later on. Whether it be this week's article, I doubt, because I have something else already I'm working on, but I will pick up this conversation again. So I look forward to talking more with you about it.
Yes, absolutely, Father, because this is, like you said, it's the bookend, it's the other side of the pro-life conversation, the conversation of the culture of life. We have to protect life from conception until natural death, like we always say. And so thank you, Father. And I think we can close with that then. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Please look at all the resources that we mentioned. You can find on the Vatican website the Declaration on Euthanasia and the Evangelium Vitae encyclical of St. John Paul II, as well as the links in our, the ethical and religious directives from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and the articles, all the links that are in our Father's article. Thank you very much again. Keep on living the culture of life. God bless.